Hello. I'm experimental engineer, and today we'll look into how biblical stories were imposed as historical facts on colonized communities, and were used to justify colonial dominance. The development of this practice involves the following components. Mosaic ethnology. European scholars and explorers explained Asian and African societies through the biblical myths of Noah's deluge, the curse on Ham, and the Tower of Babel. This resulted in what Troutman has called the Mosaic ethnology, which then became the standard interpretation regarding the histories and cultures of various kinds of colonized people. Dissenting voices existed, but were ignored or suppressed. Myth of Ham and African colonizers. Africa witnessed armed expeditions as well as slave raids from Europe, transferring large numbers of captured African peoples to distant lands. The institution of slavery became a major constituent of European and American economies. The Bible's Hamitic myth, in which the descendants of Ham were cursed by Noah into perpetual slavery, was used by the Europeans as the established truth to interpret the skin color of blacks and justify the institution of slavery. This Hamitic myth was merged with Aryan invasion theories, and then became the dominant explanation for ethnic diversity in India. Babel myth and Indologists. The leading Indologist of the late 1700s, Sir William Jones, explained the relationship between Sanskrit and European languages through the biblical story of the Tower of Babel. Hindu mythologies and scriptures were classified as corruptions of Christian truth, and the original peoples of India were described as descendants of Ham, who went to India after Noah's deluge. This biblical myth became the blueprint from which later racial stereotypes and racist interpretations of Indian society were constructed. It also justified the British rule in India as a civilizing mission to rescue the Indians, who had corrupted the original biblical truth. Institutional mechanisms. Many of the academic institutions that study Indian culture today were created during the colonial period. Some of the main axioms of biblical ethnology continue to be extant and influential in this study to this day. Biblical theory of race and the myth of Ham. According to the Bible, there was a great flood in ancient times, after which the descendants of Noah repopulated the earth. Noah's three sons were Ham, Shem and Japheth. On one occasion, Ham laughed at Noah's nudity, who felt insulted, and cursed the descendants of Ham that they must forever live in servitude, to the descendants of the other two sons. This biblical account of how the world was populated by the three descendants of Noah was accepted as veritable history in Europe. When European colonialists captured various parts of the world, the missionaries and merchants encountered unfamiliar non-Western cultures. Very soon, European accounts were constructed to fit all the populations of other cultures into the biblical framework, as descendants of one of the three sons of Noah. There was considerable debate amongst rival European intellectuals as to how each given non-European community should fit into this framework, because that would determine the community's status in terms of biblical hierarchy. The narratives of natives were dismissed as myths and superstitions. The Europeans considered it the moral authority, and indeed responsibility, to compose the true history of all cultures. In most such accounts, the dark-skinned peoples were identified as the descendants of Ham. Any culture that got branded as Hamitic was classified as barbaric, uncivilized, immoral, at times cunningly intelligent, and therefore deserving servitude. Stephen R. Haynes, a biblical historian, explains that this tendency to associate skin color with the character of a people, particularly their ability to accept Christianity, had been institutionalized within Christianity right from the beginning. For over 2 millennia, Bible readers have blamed Ham and his progeny for everything from existence of slavery, to serfdom, to the perpetuation of sexual license and perversion, to the introduction of magical arts, astrology, idolatry, and witchcraft, and heathen religion. They have associated Hamites with tyranny, theft, heresy, blasphemy, rebellion, war, and even deicide. The founder of the Protestant movement, Martin Luther, besides being a virulent anti-Semite, believed categorically that Ham and his descendants were possessed by satanic and bitter hatred. The Bible, thus, supplied the theological legitimacy for using the physical attributes of the body as the basis for moral degeneration and justification for servitude. Origen of Alexandria was one of the founding fathers and prominent theologians of the early Christian Church. He wrote that the Egyptians went into bondage because Egyptians are prone to degenerate life and indulge in vices. He wrote, "Look at the origin of the race, and you will discover that the father Ham, who had laughed at his father's nakedness, deserved a judgment of this kind, that his son Canaan should be servant to his brothers, in which case the condition of bondage would precede the wickedness of his conduct. Not without merit, therefore, does the discolored posterity imitate the ignobility of the race." Goldenberg explains the use of the term discolored by analyzing Origen's approach to skin color. One must ask why Origen chose to mention the Egyptian skin color while describing the bondage. The answer can be deduced from Origen's extensive exegetical treatment of dark skin elsewhere in the Bible. He explains the dark color of the maiden of Psalm 1:5, saying darkness is due to prior sinful condition, black because of the ignobility of birth. Between 1517 and 1840, it is estimated that 20 million Africans were captured, transported to the Americas, and enslaved in a manner that can only be considered a Holocaust. By the 18th century, as slavery became a core institution supporting Europe's economy, the Hamitic myth dominated the discourse on race relations by providing justification for slavery. Haynes writes that the advocates of slavery included respected professionals such as doctors, lawyers, politicians, clergymen, and professors, who regarded the curse of Ham as historical fact. More importantly, even the Africans who converted to Christianity themselves accepted this version of the history, as taught to them by the European masters. Thus, the slave and black poetess, Phyllis Wheatley, wrote in 1773, "Remember Christians, Africans black as Cain, may be refined and join the angelic train." In 1843, a book titled Slavery as It Relates to the Black of the African Race appeared in America. Its writer, Josiah Priest, justified black slavery by dramatizing how Noah had cursed Ham. "O Ham, my son, it is not for this one deed alone which you have just committed that I have, by God's command, thus condemned you and your race, but the Lord has shown me that all your descendants will, more or less, be like you the father, on which account, it is determined by the Creator that you and your people are to occupy the lowest condition of all the families among mankind, and even be enslaved as brute beasts, going down in the scale of human society, beyond and below the ordinary exigencies of mortal existence. And must be both in times of peace and war, a despised, degraded, and oppressed race." The book immediately became a bestseller in America during 1843–45, it was reprinted 3 times in New York, and between 1852 and 1864 it had 6 editions in Kentucky alone. The book was later called Bible Defense of Slavery, and the author, Josiah Priest, became a celebrity. In 1895, Troop Taylor, another devout Christian, wrote a pamphlet that became very popular and saw many reprints. It was titled The Prophetic Families of the Black: His Origin, Destiny and Status. It explained how the curse on Ham was passed on through Canaan to the entire black race. Canaan, who is certainly the father of the black family, was adapted to a destiny suited only to an inferior people. The prophecy begins by saying, "Cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants shall he be unto his brethren." Let us see how literally, the prophetic law embraced in this verse has been fulfilled by the black, and black alone. William Jones maps Indians onto biblical ethnology. The idea of a hierarchical, family tree, structure for the races has a long history in the Western mind. Moses is traditionally considered to be the author of the book of Genesis, which describes nations and races that originated from the descendants of Noah. Troutman refers to this idea as Mosaic ethnology. Aristotle's scale of civilizations, when combined with Mosaic ethnology, prepared the West to embrace a hierarchy with the white man naturally placed at the apex. This became the normative European paradigm from about 1780 to approximately 1850, as successive colonial Indologists theorized and debated how best to map the Indians onto the biblical framework. These luminaries included William Jones, Max Muller, Brian Horton Hodgson, and Bishop Robert Caldwell, among others. As will be demonstrated, their imprint has left modern Indian identities divided and fragmented. William Jones adopted this framework as the template onto which he mapped the languages of the world. Thus, Indian linguistics was mapped onto biblical ethnology. Jones is famous for praising Sanskrit, and arguing that the European Renaissance was brought about, in part by the study of ancient Indian texts. But he is less well known for his project of racial profiling of Indians, which, as Troutman explains, formed a rational defense of the Bible out of materials collected by Orientalist scholarship. Noah's three sons, Ham, Shem, and Japheth, were, within the biblical framework, considered to be the ancestors of all civilized peoples. Jones mapped Indians as the offspring of Ham, Arabs as the offspring of Shem, and Tartars as the offspring of Japheth. Jones used his newly discovered Sanskrit materials to claim that the Hindus had the character of Ham, and that Sanskrit literature was linked to biblical events. Through the extrapolation of coincidental syllabic similarities, Jones related the Hindu deity Ram to the biblical Rama, and Ram's son Kusa to the biblical Cusa, the grandson of Ham, and so forth. Using similar sounding names and other accidental homophones, Jones attempted to extrapolate the biblical origins. His theory was that soon after Noah's flood, Rama reconstituted Indian society. India was therefore one of the oldest biblical civilizations. His project extracted biblical correlations to verify Hindu concepts and terms. He intended to prove that the Sanskrit texts confirmed the truth of Moses' narrative in the Bible. In doing so, Jones mapped Manu as Adam, and located Vishnu's first three avatars within the story of Noah's flood. Jones then created a different Manu, whom he claimed was Noah. In this fantastic version, the biblical legend of 8 humans aboard the ark is really also about Manu plus the 7 rishis, sailing in the ship. The fourth Vishnu avatar, Nrsimha, is translated as Nimrod, a descendant of Ham who is associated with the Tower of Babel. In other words, the legitimacy and relevance of Sanskrit literature was measured, and based on where and how much it fit incidentally into the biblical master narrative. Those Indian elements that did not naturally fit into the Bible were either distorted to force them to fit, or simply rejected. For example, Jones used the biblical time scales established by the earlier British Protestants, such as Archbishop Usher's 17th-century proclamation that God had created the world in 4004 BCE, and the flood of Noah had taken place in 2349 BCE. This meant that the Indian yugas had to be rejected, because they involved huge time spans running into millions and billions of years, which, incidentally, are very close to contemporary scientific estimates regarding the age of the universe. If something was mentioned in Sanskrit texts that somehow did not fit into the Bible, it was labeled as mythology. Whatever could be made to fit became the history of the Indian peoples according to Jones. In this manner, the Vedic and Puranic texts were digested into biblical chronology. This Bible-centric framework of timescales is what led Max Muller many decades later to establish his dates for the so-called Aryan invasion of India, which influences scholars, even to this day. European scholars also saw ancient Greece and Rome as the source of Western civilization. Jones endeavored to make his translations of Sanskrit fit into the Greco-Roman frameworks. He formulated a series of parallels between the Hindu deities and the pagan gods of Greco-Roman times. He perceived that all these civilizations were descendants of Ham, who had fallen into idolatry. Ultimately, the Greco-Romans were saved by European Christianity, but the Hindus remained pagan. Jones's correlation of Hindu deities to Greco-Roman gods has endured till today, and is assumed true by both Hindus and non-Hindus. Jones's mapping of ancient India onto the Mosaic framework also served as evidence against the atheists who opposed Christianity. He used Hinduism as an independent corroboration of biblical history, following the Great Flood. He exaggerated areas of similarity between Hinduism and Christianity, to serve this agenda. Indeed, Hindu texts were used by him to argue logically in support of Christianity. Because of this overarching agenda, Jones thus positioned Hinduism from being a threat to a passive reinforcement of Christianity. Razia S. Sugatharaja, a scholar of Indian Christianity, has remarked how William Jones's philology became a theological project to fit Hindu texts into a biblical mythology. He writes, with a concern to reinforce Christianity, Jones' hermeneutical tactic was to redraw the chronological map of the world. He summarily dismissed outright the cumbersome and long drawn-out Indian history which did not fit in with his time frame. The history recorded in Genesis became the benchmark for discerning other histories, and those which did not fit in had to be squeezed in, erased, or dismissed as wild allegorical imaginings. There was no doubt in Jones's mind that Christianity was the only true religion. He mapped the Hindu trinity of Brahma, Vishnu and Shiva as the degraded version of the Christian trinity, caused by the pagans' fall from grace into polytheism. Europeans, he believed, had superior reasoning skills, and were far ahead of Asians in civilization. Asians were mere children in the area of science. The interest in studying Indian astronomy and science was to understand history, and not because they could possibly make significant mathematical and scientific contributions relevant for the present or future. Regardless of all his scholarly study of Sanskrit, Jones expressed a strong dislike for the Indians, whom he described as deluded and besotted, who would receive liberty as a curse instead of a blessing, if it were possible to give it to them, and would reject as a vase of poison. Troutman shows the compromises Jones made to fit Indian society into the biblical ethnology. For instance, he was very familiar with the Manusmriti, having translated it in 1794. However, his description of the Jatiya caste structure was a distortion of the way it is described in the Manusmriti, thus enabling Jones to fit Indians into biblical ethnology. After his death, the East India Company in England erected a statue of him in St. Paul's Cathedral, showing him carrying the books of Manu. Sanskrit texts were now positioned as a boost to biblical history, and not as a heathen threat. Jones served as an early appropriator of Hinduism, in order to enhance the credibility of Christianity. The conservative Protestant establishment recognized him for this complex if convoluted role. Another reason for early Indologists' infatuation with India was the work of Lord Monboddo, who linked ancient India to Egypt. However, the eventual decipherment of Egyptian hieroglyphics disproved his theory of the unity of Egyptian and Sanskrit. It was an academic fashion at that time to map Puranic descriptions of Indian places onto biblical geography and European topography. Ancient Ireland's history was quote-unquote proven by evidence from Sanskrit texts, with Mosaic ethnology serving as the governing paradigm. In other words, the integral unity of Indian civilization was compromised, as its various components were separated from each other, and from the Indian context, and selectively used as devices to boost biblical and European supremacy. In summary, Jones's work brought together three implicit principles. First, he used Moses' account in the Bible of the origin of all the peoples of the world, as his ethnology to classify everyone. Second, the chronology of events found in non-Western texts had to fit the time periods mandated by the Christian officials. What did not fit was either distorted to make it fit, or rejected as myth, or simply ignored. Third, the ancient wisdom found in Sanskrit texts was given great respect in the context of humanity's shared heritage, and selectively appropriated, and used as evidence to argue in favor of Christianity. Following Jones's work, German and British strands of Indology shaped the Victorian era's ideas and policies on India. Unlike the British, the Germans were not obsessed with colonialism, but were interested in mining Indian knowledge to build a Germanic identity. Some Germans plagiarized Indian thought while others argued against it, and both these camps shaped what became known as the German thought. Some British evangelists, such as those in the Pritchard School, co-opted Jones's works into their own notions of the racial inferiority of Indians. Other evangelists, like Robert Caldwell, sought to separate North Indians from South Indians, and foster an anti-North Dravidian identity. British Sanskritists have had an enduring effect on the British conception of India, and influenced subsequent Eurocentric constructions of Indian history and ethnography. Troutman describes how they shaped the principles of classification and interpretation at the highest level of generalization, which gave a degree of overall organization and intelligibility to the vast masses of ethnographic materials the personnel of the British Indian administration generated. This process can be seen as an Indological legacy, which established overarching categories and presumptions about India, which have been passed down through generations of scholars. Yale linguist Joseph Errington's book, Linguistics in a Colonial World, explains the role of William Jones to pave the way for the claim, which the earliest speakers of Sanskrit belonged to the Aryan race. This view was denounced by some European scientists at that time, but managed to become mainstream due to the rhetorical power of the early colonial Indologists, who worked unchallenged and were exalted by colonial authorities. Gradually, in certain circles the idea of an Aryan race was seen as inappropriate, and consequently, the terms Indo-European or Proto-Indo-European slowly became acceptable euphemisms for the imagined race. Errington writes about the immense power of colonial linguistics in these fabrications. One influential approach to colonialism as a world historical phenomenon, then, is to read complex, scattered events of 4 centuries into patterns of more and stronger flows of people, goods, capital, and technology around the globe. From this angle, linguists can be regarded as a small, rather special group of colonial agents, who devised necessary conduits for communication across lines of colonial power. However different the methods they used or objects they described, they transformed familiar alphabets into images of strange speech. The writing systems, or orthographies, were the common beginning point for the work of writing grammars, dictionaries, instructional texts, and so on. Colonial Indologists developed the discourse, that even though the initial Aryan invasion from Europe to the Indian subcontinent had brought an infusion of civilization, the Indians had later degenerated. Colonialism was, therefore, seen as a good thing, since it was a continuation of the previous infusion of the civilized Aryan European culture into the corrupted Asian milieu. Europeans were needed to lift the degraded Indian brothers to the past glory. By the early 20th century, it became seen as a matter of fact that the British colonizers were simply following in the footsteps of the earlier, superior Euro-Aryans entering India. The Oxford History of India, a standard textbook for candidates in the Indian civil service and higher education, made the idea of race explicit. From the Vedic hymns it has been possible to piece together a reasonably coherent picture of the Aryan invaders, on the first impact with the black-nosed, i.e. flat-nosed, Dasaris who comprised the native opponents and subjects. 100 years of British Indological institutions. The newfound Indological knowledge became recognized as an efficient tool for undermining Indian civilization and establishing British supremacy. A vast educational infrastructure was set up both in India and Britain, to deal specifically with the production and dissemination of information about India, from a colonial perspective. These institutions employed native Indians as collaborators to gain the knowledge, in an effort to map Indian texts and Sanskrit terms onto European frameworks. Also, the colonists wanted to use the Indian informants to influence other Indian scholars, using them as intermediaries, to alter the dynamics of native scholarship in the long run. Protestant evangelists and colonialists of the East India Company set up separate Indological institutions. Many of these institutions were constituted with mandates to weaken the Indian civilization, and strengthen the British side. The role of such institutions in producing skewed knowledge about India is further illustrated by a remark in the preface to the famous Sanskrit-English dictionary, by Sir Monier Williams. As the professor occupying the prestigious Bowden Chair for Sanskrit Studies at Oxford, Monier Williams explained the objective of Colonel Joseph Bowden, who endowed that prestigious chair. Monier Williams wrote, Colonel Bowden stated most explicitly in his will, dated August 15, 1811, that the special object of his munificent bequest was to promote the translation of the scriptures into Sanskrit, so as to enable his countrymen to proceed in the conversion of the natives of India to the Christian religion. Monier Williams also famously wrote, when the walls of the mighty fortress of Brahmanism are encircled, undermined, and finally stormed by the soldiers of the cross, the victory of Christianity must be signal and complete. Colonial Indology was based on collaborations between Western academics and Indian scholars. This approach can be compared to similar arrangements in today's South Asian studies, which involve collaborations between the Western government, corporations, and private foundations, universities, and human rights groups. This video was inspired by the book Breaking India by Rajiv Malhotra and Aravindan Neelkandan. The link to purchase the book is provided in the description, down below. If you like this video, please consider giving it a thumbs up and subscribing to the channel. This is me, Experimental Engineer, signing off.